I got it. Don't worry, that'd be embarrassing. Hi, just welcome. Hi, right here. Hi, thanks for being here. You can take hello. You're welcome. You're welcome. Hello.
So I remember all your pictures.
This was my first fight trying my casual tie.
It's great mirror now, so hopefully it's going to get started better.
Pressure, but if the video falls by Dana Prino's going to play part of it on the 5.
Well, maybe
The pressure.
So, we are streaming.
It works.
Yeah. Okay. People on YouTube can watch at this moment.
All right.
Well, I want to thank everybody. Wow, that's a great microphone. I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's an exciting day for the House Republican Policy Committee. It's our first hearing of the 114th Congress. I'm sure many of you may be wondering, although we've got a room full of millennials, so maybe not, of all the topics we could cover in our first hearing, why would we choose millennials and the GOP? The truth is there are several reasons. First, millennials are our nation's next generation of leaders. These young adults, age 18 to 34, will be shaping policy and the course of this country over the next several decades. Their ideas, energy, and ingenuity are keys to America's success in the 21st century. Therefore, bringing millennials into the political process will make our nation and our party stronger. Think about this. 4/5 of millennials don't consider themselves politically engaged. 40% don't affiliate themselves with either major political party. Frankly, I think that means it's our job as Republicans to prove to these young constituents we care about their interests more than we care about special interests. We have to show them that their opinions matter to us, we value their input, and share their principles. We have to demonstrate that our ideas and policies will make their lives better. We can do that by listening and crafting smart policies that actually do make their lives better. With this Millennial Task Force, we're starting today to lay the groundwork for getting that done. Is all about getting to know the millennial generation better, their political, demographic, and cultural attributes, what makes them tick. We already know most millennials don't trust government institutions to do the right thing most or even some of the time. In fact, only 25% trust the federal government and just 17% trust Congress. The skepticism and cynicism many millennials have towards government is alarming. However, it's not unwarranted. Today's hyper-partisanship and overheated political rhetoric have caused many Americans, millennial or not, to question whether either major political party is looking out for them. Millennials want more than empty promises of hope and change. They want their voices heard and their ideas taken seriously. And our Millennial Task Force will focus on solving their problems because America's future depends on the millennial generation's ability to live the American dream. As this room knows, our first female millennial has already been elected to Congress, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. And we're pleased to have her heading our task force on millennials and chairing this hearing today. I want to thank my colleagues who are here today as well. We're fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts that Congresswoman Stefanik will introduce. And we're also going to hear from a number of millennials in our audience today. Those of you in the audience or watching online who have questions for our witnesses, you can tweet them to us using the hashtag GOPFuture. We may ask your question if time permits. Lastly, before I turn the gavel over to the gentlelady from New York, I want to commend our conference chair, Kathy McMorris-Rogers, for her focus on millennials and her work to ensure that House Republicans focus on a positive, results-oriented agenda that helps create an opportunity economy for all. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, the chair of the Policy Committee's Millennial Task Force, Congresswoman Stefanik, who is chairing today's hearing.
This is my first time using a gavel around here, so this is very exciting. Thank you, Chairman Messer. It is a distinct honor to chair the Millennial Task Force. This hearing will be the first in a series where we take deep dives into the key issues facing my generation. I would also like to thank our distinguished panel of witnesses here today for taking the time to come to Washington, D.C. to share your expert research with us. As a millennial myself, I am eager to hear the ways that we as lawmakers can better reach our generation. Millennials have now surpassed Generation Xers as the largest generation in the U.S. labor force. In fact, more than 1 in 3 American workers today are millennials. There are approximately 80 million members of the millennial generation. Understanding how we think and how best to communicate with us will be essential in both business and public service. The unemployment rate for those aged 20 to 24 is a staggering 10.1%, almost double the national rate of 5.5%. Labor force participation rate for 20 to 24-year-olds was 71% in 2012, compared to 76% in 2002 and 77% in 1992. College affordability will continue to remain a challenge for millennials and future generations. We must find ways to control the rising cost of tuition and empower students to choose the school that gives them the best return on their investment. This means we need to rethink the way that financial information is disseminated to students so that they can make the best choice as a consumer. Today, our national debt is $18.3 trillion. If we continue on our current trajectory, in 2025, it will be $27.3 trillion. This unsustainable debt load will continue to hamper our generation's economic growth. One of the key issues pervasive throughout millennial communications in social media is government transparency, accountability, and access. Millennials are a generation that expects their government to be open and honest, even if the message they deliver isn't what we want to hear. And millennials, unfortunately, are losing interest in working service to bring change to government. A recent Time magazine poll found that 89% of millennials are not interested in running for office in the future. Quote, "We gave the kids a list of 24 jobs and asked which they would consider for the future. Things like business owner, journalist, doctor, mechanic, professional athlete, mayor of a small town, and so on. And we found that a lot of people were interested in multiple positions, but the political positions fared pretty poorly. Mayor ranked the highest, and it was only 12th on the list. As members of Congress begin to retire from previous generations, it is imperative that a new generation of leaders step up to the plate. This will only happen if there is a baseline recognition that government is trying to work for our generation. I believe that millennials have a unique perspective that can help craft a vision for our future. and we strive to answer tough questions about how to construct an empowerment economy. I also believe that millennials are an optimistic generation, and they can teach us once more to be a leading voice in the world. Thank you for attending this hearing today. I'm so excited to see there it's standing room left only. And I look forward to the testimony and a lively Q&A session that will follow. But I now want to take the opportunity to recognize other members of the task force who will give opening statements based on their seniority and when they arrived at the meeting. So first, my colleague, Representative Susan Brooks from Indiana.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stefanik. It's great to be here. And I think when we talk about seniority, we might have to talk about, I think I am the oldest person in this room. Okay, so let's just start it out. I am a boomer. And, but I really want to thank my fellow Hoosier, Congressman Messer, for calling us together today to discuss a generation that will define America's success in the 21st century. I'd also like to thank Congresswoman Stefanik for creating and leading and helping put together the Millennial Task Force. Understanding what millennials need and want is of utmost importance if we want a prosperous future in our country. And as you've already heard, millennials make up at least 25% of the population, and yet millennials are our largest and most diverse part of our population in the United States. Obviously, inventions by millennials have changed our world. They certainly have changed my world. I used Uber last weekend at home, back in Carmel, Indiana. I now communicate with my 22-year-old almost exclusively by this phone, and not by him calling me, but by him texting me. And whether it's Facebook, Twitter, yes, I just got on Instagram, and I'm about to get on Snapchat. So we're gonna get there. Okay, but it takes some of us a little bit longer to get to this. So many of these innovations, though, and the entrepreneurial spirit of the millennial generation, I think is something that reflects the Republican Party's ideals, our fundamental belief in entrepreneurship and innovation and the power of the individual. So we are the party that believes in America's system of entrepreneurship. Keep in mind, by the 2020 election, millennials will account for over a third of the workforce, so I've read. And so millennials coming into their 30s will be an even very important consumer group, but most importantly, an incredibly significant voting bloc. That's why this task force is so critically important. As you've heard me say, I am the mother of two millennials, a 22 and a 25-year-old. They have taught me so very much. And you all have much that you can teach generations that are before you. I came to Congress to make a difference for my children, and you hear that all the time, okay, from most politicians, that they came to their office to make a difference. Well, it truly is a fact. We need to make a difference, whether it's the $18.2 trillion debt, whether it's your student loan debt that so many millennials have, whether it is the difficulties that millennials are having breaking into the workforce. These are the things that we need to focus on, whether it's finding out solutions for us to make sure there's some semblance of Social Security there for you for the future. There are so many systems that we need to make sure are there for your future. Millennials are the most educated group of Americans in the country. And so think about that. As the most educated Americans in the country, we need your solutions, we need your ideas. But yet you face greater roadblocks into many ways the entry of society, whether it's home ownership, whether it is, getting rid of that student debt, whether it is getting into that workforce and on the career path that you want. So these are the types of things we want to focus on. I'm very excited to have so many, my staff of all millennials now, and just very pleased to have their participation, and for all of the staff who are here, thank you for your work, educating us, informing us. Please speak up. Don't be part of the silent generation, which is actually a generation before boomers. Don't be a part of the silent generation. Be a part, and we know you are, a part of that disruptive generation. So look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you for convening this.
I now yield to the gentleman from Missouri, the youngest congressman in the Republican Conference.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's a pleasure to be before the committee and for you chairing it, and the chair of the policy committee. Thanks for hosting this, and thank every one of you for being here. When you hear individuals across the country talk about millennials, They say millennials don't care about government. Public service, a lot of sense. I'd like for them to look at this room. A lot of the committee rooms that I have sat in my last 2 years in Congress, I've never seen a room this full. So that tells a lot, and the average age in this room makes me feel old. So that's typically not the case in Congress that we serve in. The average age of Congress is 57 years old. I'm the second youngest Republican. I've always been the second youngest. It was Congressman Schock, and now it's Elise Stefanik. So it's an interesting body up here. I think the statistics, if you look at, there's 31 of us that's under 40 that's currently serving in the House of Representatives. 20 are Republican, 11 are Democrats. The average age of the House leadership, the Republican average age is 19 years younger than the Democrats' average age of House leadership. A lot of people don't know that. When you look at just the average age of Republican members, they're 6 years younger than the average age of Democrat members. So we are the younger party. And we're the party that I believe that represents millennials the best. When you look at entrepreneurship, growing opportunities, optimism. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all the witnesses today to hear what you have to say, and also questions from the audience. I think that will be quite exciting, but it's just a great opportunity and privilege to be here. And I do want to point out something that I was researching this week. If you look at the last 6 presidential races, the last 6, 5 of the last 6, the youngest candidate has won. And I like to point out Hillary Clinton will be 69 in the 2016 race and will be the oldest of any of the Republican nominees right now. So I think that's good odds. And the one race out of the last 6 was between President Bush and Al Gore, and they were only a year apart in age. So let's go, youth.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Costello.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Just real briefly biographically about me, I'm 38 years old. I had my first child about 18 months ago, so I'm not very far removed from thinking and feeling like many of those I'm looking at in the audience have. But in college, I did my honors thesis on Generation X and a lot of the political trends and how that might shape the future of politics and political culture. And I found it to be a very interesting subject. My one professor who was sort of overseeing my project was always cautious to warn me that you need to make sure that when you're speaking generationally that you don't allow yourself to speak too much about generality. Obviously every millennial is an individual with their own hopes and dreams and ambitions, but yet you can look at a lot of data trends and sort of where things are headed through research and polling, and you can develop a set of policy proposals. And I really applaud the chairwoman of this task force, Ms. Stefanik, as well as Chairman Messer of the Policy Committee, for bringing this front and center. I think it's very healthy for our party. I think it's very healthy for our country. And so I'm very much looking forward to be a part of this task force and hear the testimony and work with Elise and Luke and everyone here and in the conference to develop smart policy, forward-looking, that's going to be of benefit to you and your friends and the future generations in this country, because that's why we're all here. I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Hardy from Nevada and Representative Walter from California, for attending today. And I want to turn it over to the witnesses. We are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today. I'm going to briefly introduce all 4 of you, and then we'll open it up to your opening statements. The first to my left is John Della Volpe, who I used to work with as a student. He is the Director of Polling at the Harvard Institute of Politics. Each semester, John leads a public opinion survey group of students who develop, field, and report on the attitudes of young Americans towards politics and public service. Since 2000, the IOP survey has tracked pre- and post-9/11 attitudes, accurately predicting youth turnout, marked the generational shift in attitudes toward foreign policy, and provided insights into the ways in which millennials communicate and form opinions. Kristen Soltis Anderson is the co-founder of Echelon Insights, an opinion research, data analysis, and digital intelligence firm. She's also a columnist for the Daily Beast. She previously was a resident fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics and formerly served as vice president of the Winston Group, a polling firm in Washington. In 2013, she was named one of Time Magazine's 30 Under 30 Changing the World, and as one of National Journal Magazine's 25 most influential women under 35 in Washington. Scott Keeter is the Director of Survey Research at the Pew Research Center. Scott serves as the Chief Survey Methodologist for the Center, providing guidance to all of the Center's research areas. An expert on American public opinion and political behavior, he has co-authored several books and published multiple articles on politics and political behavior. He is a past president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research and has been an election night analyst of exit polls for NBC News since 1980. Jared Meyer, a millennial, is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. His research interests include microeconomic theory and the economic effects of government regulations. Mr. Meyer also publishes and presents on the need for a moral foundation for free markets. His research has been cited by numerous publications, including Yahoo Finance, the Chicago Sun-Times, Forbes.com, the New York Post, and the Christian Science Monitor. He has appeared on numerous radio shows, including the BBC World Service and NPR. His most recent book, Disinherited: How Washington is Betraying America's Young, co-authored with Diana Fergot Roth, was published in May of this year. And the chair now recognizes Mr. Della Volpe for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairman Messer, Chairwoman Stefanik, and members of the committee. It's an honor to be asked to participate in this inaugural hearing of the Millennial Task Force and represent the Institute of Politics at Harvard, where, as you've noted, I've directed the program on polling since 2000. And also my company, Social Sphere, which advises public and private clients around the world on ways to engage more effectively with millennials through social media analytics and engagement. For the better part of 50 years, our mission at the IOP has been focused on engaging young Americans in politics and public service. Most noble calling, because as President Kennedy stated to Congress in 1963, the future promise of any nation can be directly measured by the present prospects of its youth. I often say that I'm embedded with millennials, largest generation in America's history, through my work on campus at Harvard, my research. Most people in my company are millennials, and I have 3 at home, as many as you do as well. Our polling program at the IOP was conceived by 2 undergraduates in the late 1990s because of their belief that their peers were increasingly disengaged politically and had lost faith in government institutions to solve important problems. They had asked me to work with them on a project to understand the causes of this disaffection and develop a strategy to reverse it. One of the first and most important findings we found was that young Americans drew a significant distinction between social activism and political activism. Social activism was defined largely as local, micro, effective, and tangible. Political activism was defined, in contrast, as distant, macro, bureaucratic, and abstract. Because of these strong feelings, those of folks in their 30s now, came of age politically during the new millennium, believed that the only way to change things was to do it themselves, through volunteerism, one good deed at a time, outside of government and away from politics and politicians. So 15 years ago, in our first of those 27 reports, we noted that 2/3 of college students did not trust the federal government to do the right thing most or all the time, 15 years ago. And an astounding 3/4 believed that politicians were involved in the process for mostly selfish reasons. Despite glimmers of hope from time to time, I now sit before this committee 15 years later, after an attack on our homeland, natural disasters like Katrina, a global war on terror, an inspiring presidential campaign, and a great recession, to say that little has changed. According to our last survey, which we released in April, 72% of college students do not trust the federal government to do the right thing all or most of the time. 67% believe elected officials seem to be motivated by selfish reasons. While we've seen significant progress in the days after 9/11, when participation among young people increased in the 2002, 2004, 2006, and 2008 elections, unfortunately, this positive trend has dissipated and stopped. We see lower numbers of youth participation, especially in off-year and less contested elections. But it doesn't have to be this way. Barack Obama proved in 2008, and so can any number of Democrats and Republicans in 2016. There was little doubt that in 2008, members of the millennial generation were among the core groups that elected the president. From Iowa caucus, the president one dominated the youth vote but lost everybody over the age of 30. Young people were responsible for electing Barack Obama president and turning several states from red to blue in the general election. When our 12th Harvard survey was released in 2007, he was already up by 17 points and essentially kind of walked away with that election. Nearly 2 in 5 college students at that time were politically engaged. There were more than twice as many self-identified liberals as conservatives in the student population in 2007, 2008. The majority of students told us they were prepared to volunteer in a campaign of fast, majority. And the dominant issue of that day was war and peace. A remarkable 52% of college students in our poll's open-ended question were concerned mostly about the global war on terror. Now, 8 years later, as the current campaign begins to take shape, the members of the electorate that elected Obama president is decidedly different. While they most likely will support the Democratic nominee for president, the degree of the margin is key. Will it be the Obama margins of 34 and 23 points, or will it be the John Kerry margin in 2004 of 9 points, which is a key factor in his defeats of President Bush? I believe that's an open question, and to unpack the answer is critical to understand this generation. For example, today on college campuses, self-identified liberals outnumber conservatives by only 7 points, 40% to 33%, compared to 33 to 16% in 2007. Half as many students today consider themselves to be politically engaged as they did in 2007. And only 1 in 5 of the 53 to 29-year-olds identify themselves as politically active. Issues related to war, terror, and national security are a fraction of what they were. The driving issue, as noted earlier, is the economy. In fact, the economy is one issue that tends to unite most young people of all political stripes. For example, a majority believe income inequality is a major problem facing the country. 80% believe student debt is a significant problem. And 70% in one of our recent surveys indicated that financial circumstances played a role in the decision to higher education. All of those who seek to inspire the youngest generation face an enormous challenge with young voters. To rebuild trust and faith in their own endeavors, I developed 5 key things I believe everybody should know about the youth electorate today. Number 1, it starts with trust. Fewer than half of 18 to 29-year-olds in America trust the president, Congress, the federal government, Wall Street, or the media to do the right thing all or most of the time. While this year's poll showed some increases relative to last year, significant historic lows, efforts must be made by candidates, members of each political party to repair those wounds. Our future depends on it. Number 2, for our youngest voters, the idea of American justice is an open question. In the aftermath of incidents in Ferguson and New York City, our polls conducted in March and April of this year, before the first North Charleston incident, 49% of 18 to 29-year-olds indicated they do not have confidence in the U.S. judicial system's ability to fairly judge people without bias for race and ethnicity. When the results are analyzed by race, we find 66% of black Americans have little or no confidence, compared to 43% of white Americans, and the majority of Hispanics feel the same way. Third, youth are seeking a more forceful U.S. presence abroad. And starting with the opinions of millennials a decade ago, 57% of millennials in America support the use of ground troops in the Middle East to combat ISIS. In addition, we noted a 7-point increase in support for the Bush Doctrine, although still a minority, and a 10-point increase in the number of young Americans who believe the U.S. should take the lead in solving international crises and conflicts. 4, attitudes of the youth about the role of politics and government defy traditional labels. While we studied opinions related to a broad set of ideological issues, we find millennials are far more nuanced than the stereotype of a knee-jerk left-leaning advocate. While there's plenty of support for same-sex marriage, healthcare, legalization of marijuana, and other issues, we also find cutting taxes to increase economic growth is favored by a 2-to-1 margin, and school choice has been popular among Democrats, Republicans, and Independents for a decade. Additionally, a majority tell us that while they're concerned with the moral direction of the country, while young Democrats and Republicans view moral issues through a different political lens, the millennial moral compass extends beyond traditional social issues to include views of government's role in helping the needy, human rights, and America's role in the world. Candidates who tap into these deep-seated beliefs will find themselves connected with the millennials. 5th and final, millennials are defining their own brand of optimism and believe in the promise of America. While 73% of college students expect they will have a difficult time finding a job after graduation, millennials are becoming more optimistic about the country and the future on a daily basis. By more than a 3-to-1 margin, they believe they will be better off than their parents, an improvement over last year, and 65% classify their personal financial situation as very or fairly good at the moment. Unlike previous generations, millennials often define happiness through both tangible and intangible gifts that extend beyond bank accounts and property to things like professional, personal flexibility, and opportunities to serve. Democrats still enjoy a broad advantage over Republicans nationally, but despite these numbers, Democrats should not count on millennials to mirror the historical effort that propelled President Obama in 2008. For the current crop of millennials who were raised in the aftermath of gridlock and recession, winning votes will require the right mix of strength, trust, inspiration, and vision. There are millions of young people engaged every day to make their communities and the country a better place. They raise their hands and volunteer online and offline. They seek ways to be inspired and will respond when engaged. Many of them are in this room. They are the new millennials, and we must identify the most passionate ones seeking to make our country a better place, empower them, and ask them for more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Della Volpe. The chair now recognizes Ms. Anderson for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Congressman Stefanik, and thank you to the committee for having me here. I've been focused on this question since around the 2008 election, when I too was writing a thesis trying to understand my generation and the political trends associated with it, much like Congressman Costello. And in the 6 years since, I've continued to try to follow this question because I believe it's of critical importance, not just for the Republican Party, but for the nation. Born between the years of 1980 and 2000, the millennial generation in America is coming of age and participating in the political process in extraordinary numbers. There are currently an estimated 75 million millennials in the United States, and a young man or woman who turns 18 on the eve of the coming presidential election, based on average life expectancy, will continue casting votes until the election of 2076. So the political impact of the millennial generation is only just beginning to be felt in full. Both as a matter of politics and policy, understanding this generation is of vital importance. The cultural and technological changes that are embodied and expressed by this generation have a lot to tell us, not just about the present, but about our nation's future. And while within any group of 75 million people, there's going to be a great diversity of opinion and life experiences, and therefore there's danger in applying any single label to across all 75 million of those folks, in this case the label of millennial, I do believe there are a number of common themes that can help older adults understand what younger Americans are going through today. Millennials will lead very different lives than their parents or grandparents. They're coming of age in an era of incredible diversity, of rapid innovation, and of major cultural change. And the first step toward creating policy that makes sense for this generation is to understand what millennial lives are like. 30 or 40 years ago, the expectation was that young men and women would get their driver's license, graduate from high school, maybe go to college, get married in their early to mid-20s, buy a home, have children, and most likely stay working for the same company or industry for a number of years. They'd read the paper in the morning, they'd watch the TV news at night, and they'd go to church on Sunday. Today, young adults are less likely to get married early, less likely to go to church on Sunday, more likely to change jobs. They're less likely to own a home, but are much more likely to have student debt. They're more likely to get their news from Facebook than from local TV news. They're even less likely to have a driver's license. In 1983, roughly 80% of 18-year-olds had a driver's license, a number that had fallen to roughly 60% by 2010. And all of these changes have led employers, educational institutions, the media, and corporate America to reassess how they provide jobs, skills, information, and services to this new generation of adults. Yet while millennial lives may look very different, they share many of the same core values that have been timeless in America. Take family. Millennials may define family in a very different way than older generations, are more comfortable with alternative family structures, but they're just as likely to have children and are more likely to live with more than one generation under the same roof. They may have a broad and very flexible definition of family, but a majority say that being a great parent is one of the most important things in life, a 10-point increase from what Generation Xers said in 1997 when they were young adults and were asked the same question by the Pew Research Center. Or consider faith. Millennials may be less likely to go to church regularly and are organized religion as an institution, but faith remains hugely important to many millennials. While the number of unaffiliated is rising, a significant majority still do identify with the religion, and according to polling by Harvard's Institute of Politics, 79% of those who are religiously affiliated say their faith is very important in their lives. Young adults are more likely to say that they pray daily than did young adults in the 1980s or 1990s, and on a whole host of other metrics, ranging from the decline in teen pregnancy to declines in hard drug use. Millennials are actually making more responsible choices than the young adults of previous generations. They may not be interested in casting judgment on others, but are taking personal responsibility in their own lives and are trying to make smart choices. The rise of the millennial generation also coincides with an explosion of demographic diversity in the United States. In the 1992 election, 87% of voters identified as white. By the 2012 election, that had fallen 15 points to 72%, and that rise in diversity is most heavily concentrated among the youngest voters. It has also coincided with an explosion of technology that has revolutionized how we consume products and information. 9 out of 10 millennials have a smartphone, according to the American Press Institute, and 82% say they get most of their news and information online. According to ComScore, 3/4 of those aged 18 to 34 say they use the mobile app regularly. And in recent years, visual storytelling apps like Instagram and Snapchat have exploded in popularity. Even as millennials are disconnecting from traditional media sources like hard copies of the newspaper, they're becoming increasingly connected to one another, sharing news, information, even their own homes and cars through things like Uber and Airbnb. I believe that Republicans should not fear these changes, but instead embrace them. In 2013, after the last presidential election, I conducted a major research project on behalf of the College Republican National Committee, aimed at understanding how young voters thought about politics and policy. In our survey of voters under the age of 30, we opened with a simple, non-political question. Which words do you most wish your friends would use to describe you? And we gave our respondents a number of options. Cool, unique, adventurous. There were about 36 words they could choose from. The top responses: intelligent, caring, hardworking, and responsible. Millennials may have experiences, families, and careers that will look different from their parents and grandparents, and they may be driving enormous changes in how America looks and lives, but they share many of the same values that have been at the core of previous generations of Americans. Nonetheless, the need for public policies that address this generation's unique needs is great. From things as basic and serious as making it easier to launch a business or to get affordable higher education, to things like increasing the availability of open data and rethinking how we structure the federal workforce to better attract young talent. There's much that's waiting to be disrupted and made for and by this generation. The task force is focused on understanding who millennials are, what issues matter to them, and how they get their information. Millennials are a generation increasingly disconnected from traditional institutions and increasingly connected to one another. They're structuring their lives in different ways than their parents and grandparents, but they share many of the timeless values that built this nation. And even as they are eschewing many of the traditional commitments like marriage or home ownership, in many cases this is driven as much by economic reality as it is by simple preference. They want to feel control over their own futures, even as they express frustration and disappointment with issues like the national debt. They remain confident in their own generation's ability to fix these problems, and in that way remain very optimistic. With data from the Pew Research Center showing that millennials are more likely than Generation Xers, baby boomers, or those of the silent generation to say that America's best days are ahead of it. When Pew asked American voters what they are most looking for in this upcoming election, a majority of those in each age group over 30 said that they would value experience and a proven record. For those under 30, however, 56% said they'd rather see new ideas and a different approach. I'm grateful to have been invited to present to this committee today to discuss what some of those new ideas could look like, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I just want to briefly recognize Representative Palmer from Alabama and Representative Hurd from Texas. Thank you for joining us today. The chair now recognizes Mr. Keeter for an opening statement.
Thank you, Congressman and the committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. I always am a little uncomfortable as a older side of the baby boom talking about millennials, but I would stress that I am channeling a great deal of research by the fine staff of the Pew Research Center, which is dominated by millennials, as it sounds like Capitol Hill is. I'm just going to hit the key points in my written testimony, which is much more extensive and draws on a number of the studies that you've already heard quoted here. And I will attempt to take Congressman Costello's advice to not engage in too many generalities, but then that's sort of what we have to do to be able to describe the generation. But I think it's very important to note that the generation is not only very diverse in terms of its race and ethnicity, but also in terms of its political views. My findings that I'll be talking about here are based on Both surveys that we've conducted as well as our analyses of important government surveys like the American Community Survey and the Current Population Survey, which provide us with very critical information about the economic and demographic characteristics of this generation. So let me also note that the Pew Research Center is a strictly nonpartisan organization. We don't take positions on issues. Now, generational analysis is arbitrary. It depends upon a number of fine distinctions that are difficult to make, but there's a general agreement, and I think I've heard it from the previous two witnesses, that the millennial generation started around 1980, and adults born after that time are who we consider to be a part of the millennial generation. It's a big generation, as you've heard, the largest generation of adults in the country, the largest group within the labor force. It's very diverse. 43% are non-white, including 21% who are Hispanic. By comparison, only about half as many of the oldest generation today are non-white. And as we've heard, it is the best educated generation. 34% have a bachelor's degree or more. But it is facing a number of difficulties. It came of age and entered the labor force in the midst of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and that has led to a number of different struggles. Millennials have a higher rate of unemployment, they have higher rates of poverty, they have higher rates of student loan debt, and they have lower accumulated wealth than any of the previous generations had at the time that they were the same age today. 2/3 of millennials who have recently graduated with BAs have student loan debt that averages $27,000 per person, and young householders who are heading households, 37% currently have student debt. I would also note that despite the high level of education of this generation, there are big differences between college-educated millennials and others in how they're coping with the economy. College education is providing tremendous benefits to millennials, more so in some respects than to other generations, and those who don't have a college education are struggling very substantially in today's economic circumstances. The millennials have a number of other characteristics that are important, I think, for this committee's consideration. They're far less likely to be married than were previous generations at the same point in their life cycle. 26% of millennials today compared with 65% of the silent generation when they were the same age earlier in their lives. Almost half of births to millennial women today are out of wedlock, unmarried women having children. This is not to say that millennials approve of this. They are about as likely as other generations to say that it's better for children to be born into a marriage, but circumstances have changed and it is much more characteristic today than it has ever been in the past for millennials. One other insight that I would note has already been mentioned, and that is that millennials are much less likely than other generations to be affiliated with a religious tradition. We estimate that 35% of millennials today are atheist, agnostic, or say that they have no religion in particular. But it's also true the majority are affiliated, and many of those who are affiliated are just as religious as older generations. Now, turning to attitudes, millennials have followed the course of other generations in terms of losing trust in government. They've declined at about the same rates as other generations in terms of saying that you can't trust the government. But they remain more supportive of what government is trying to do. We ask a kind of summary question about whether you think the government ought to be bigger and provide more services or smaller and provide fewer services. Millennials remain the only generation in the country today that where a majority supports the idea of a bigger government. As a result of that, I think everyone here is familiar with the fact that millennials continue to identify more with the Democratic Party than with the Republican Party, although there has been a decline, a trend over time in that there's still more Democratic or Democratic-leaning millennials than Republicans by a margin, according to our polling, of 51 to 35. But because of their lower levels of political participation, particularly in off-year elections, their political clout has really not fully been felt. We've tried to summarize a lot of these trends in terms of political values in an index of political liberalism or conservatism, and I'll just hit a couple of the high points here. Millennials are more likely to be liberal than conservative on a range of issues that we've summarized. 41% hold mostly or consistently liberal attitudes, compared with only 15% who hold conservative views, and that is considerably different from those of other generations. For the Republicans, it is also a challenge, for while there aren't substantial ideological differences by generation within the Democratic Party, there are significant ideological differences among the generations in terms of ideology, with younger Republicans being more liberal. Not saying that they are liberal, but they are less conservative than older generations. A couple of issues that I wanted to touch on. The one that's continually in the spotlight here on Capitol Hill is the question of what to do with people who are in the country illegally. We find that all generations, majorities of all generations, favored some kind of path to legal status for undocumented immigrants, but it's only among the millennials that there is actually a majority that favors a path to citizenship. In terms of the issues that millennials see as a top priority, they're actually very similar to those of other generations, with one exception. Millennials are much more likely, I think for understandable reasons, to prioritize education as a top priority. And then finally, I'll just touch on some of the findings that have been mentioned before. Millennials are less interested in politics, but they still get political news. They just don't get it from the same places that other adults do. We find that 61% say that they get news from Facebook on a fairly regular basis. That is significantly higher than for other generations. Gen Xers are catching up with them, but it still seems to be the main place for the news diet for the millennial generation. And television, while still important for many millennials, is much less important. I thank you very much for the time and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keeter. The chair now recognizes Mr. Meyer.
Well, members of the House Republican Policy Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on how to begin shaping the Republican agenda to really fit the needs of millennials and understand what they're looking for. Currently, I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I'm the author of Disinherited: How Washington is Betraying America's Young. But I promise, none of you were the subject of my book. So, well, young Americans realize that they're getting a raw deal. In our research for Disinherited, my co-author Diana Furchtgott-Roth and I spoke to many millennials, and we found that their largest concern was getting jobs and building their careers. But unfortunately, many federal policies are standing in their way. And as Congresswoman Stefanik pointed out, the economic recovery has left young Americans behind. The unemployment rate for young people ages 20 to 24 is twice the rate for those over 25. And the teen unemployment rate is even worse, at 18%. And it's not only that young Americans cannot find work, but they're also being asked to shoulder the fiscal burdens placed on them by prior generations. On top of our growing national debt, we also have unfunded promises for entitlement programs that are going to have to be paid for by millennials in the terms of lower services or higher taxes. And federal student loan debt has now surpassed $1 trillion, and a lot of government labor market regulations make it more difficult to build a career even after graduation. Now, to correct the mistreatment of millennials, leaders in Washington need to evaluate policies through the prism of how they affect new entrants to the workforce. The young proportionally do not vote, as we heard from the earlier panelists, as their turnout rate in the 2012 election was 41% compared with 72% for those over 65. It seems as if seniors take voting as a job. But this presents an opportunity for candidates to provide a reason for millennials to show up on election day and to be politically engaged in the months prior. And one of the reasons many millennials choose not to vote is because they feel left behind by politicians in both parties. On a whole, they tend to be socially liberal, yet more fiscally conservative. And many millennials worry about openly supporting free market policies because doing so could also signal a position that they're supporting conservative policies on social issues or foreign policy, which in general I strongly disagree with. But millennials remain politically unaligned as a group. They are tired of the lack of effective government solutions that they are seeing to the country's problems. 2/3 of millennials now perceive government to be inefficient and wasteful, and the last 5 years have really left a sour taste in millennials' mouths. Back in 2009, this number was 40%. So just in a few years, it went up from 40% to 2/3. But because of the promising rise of popular sharing economy services such as Uber and Airbnb, and the hostile response of some legislatures, mostly on the state and local level, only 18% of millennials now view government regulators as having the public's interest in mind. That's only 18%. And this is because young people realize that many regulations serve to protect special interests, not protect public safety. And these so-called, I've heard it termed Ubertarians, they want companies to be held liable for harming consumers still, but they don't want bureaucrats in Washington dictating how companies need to meet consumers' needs or get permission to innovate. I mean, it's really difficult to find a millennial who wants the government to be able to tell Apple how many iPhones they can make or what features they want on the next model. And excessive regulation in general, it cuts off a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurship. And this is something that's highly valued by millennials, as over 70% want to eventually work independently at some point in their careers. But against this, the Code of US Federal Regulations now stands at over 175,000 pages. And we're going to see the same path that has happened for the last 30 years. Federal regulators are going to keep adding to this total by bringing new industries under their purview. But these thousands of pages of regulation aren't just legal rambling. Instead, in these pages, there are over 1 million terms that are restrictive, such as must, cannot, or shall. And starting or running a business, we all know it takes a lot of time and hard work. Attempting to comprehend which of these million restrictions apply to an entrepreneur's business is frankly a waste of their resources. And it's no coincidence that the internet technology field is where young people are finding the most opportunity, and also that it's the least regulated. If innovative entrepreneurs behind Congresswoman Brooks, some of her favorite companies, if they had to gain government's permission to innovate or comply with as many regulations as the energy or manufacturing sector, I doubt we would have seen Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, or even Apple. These pioneering companies, young Americans, they use them every day, not only for entertainment, but also, as you pointed out, how they get their news. This is how they stay engaged with the political process. Unfortunately, there's no American Association of Young Persons to counter the influence of the AARP, which consistently ranks in the top 1% of donors to campaigns. But millennials want elected leaders, and they want someone who will stand up for them to restore economic opportunity to their generation. The political party that can brand itself as the party of entrepreneurship and innovation is the party that will finally be able to claim at least a good portion of the millennial generation. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to all of your questions and from the audience.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. I now recognize myself to kick us off asking questions here, and then I will turn it over to Chairman Messer, and we'll go from there with the other members of the task force. So one of the consistencies between all of your presentations is the lack of trust in government. Mr. Della Volpe, you talked about how one of the key qualities that identify millennials as a generation is trust. You also identify that 72% of college students do not trust government to do the right thing. And Mr. Meyer, you just mentioned that 2/3 believe government is inefficient and wasteful. On the optimistic side, Ms. Anderson talked for greater transparency and open data in how government functions. Can each of you share common sense suggestions about how we can increase transparency in government and increase that access to open data?
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Stefanik. One of the greatest lessons I've learned in the 15 years comes not only from the data, but from hundreds of focus groups and conversations that we've had with millennials. And I think it's striking the fact that although it's sometimes difficult to measure in a survey, young people in every community across the country seem focused on finding a way to volunteer to give back to somebody. Sometimes it's hard to measure. Sometimes it's mowing the lawn of your elderly neighbor or helping in the church. But they care deeply about making their community and therefore their country a better place. And one of the most common sense suggestions that I have is for members of Congress and legislatures around the country is to identify those young people and let them know that they can make a difference outside of the traditional ways in which they think about serving. For example, there are thousands of young people who have a point of view on ways in which they would like to get involved. And I think we can identify them through the social media tools and technologies that we have, and I suggest that we empower them and not just include expert witnesses, but obviously include young people and let them be kind of a part of the process. You won't be disappointed if you find ways to do that within the overall workings of government.
So I would suggest looking to the cities. Cities like Chicago, Indianapolis, cities that have mayors of both parties have done extraordinary things in terms of opening up their data, not so that government can necessarily build apps that tap into that data, but so that people on the outside can come up with interesting ideas that tap into those data sources and create interesting services for citizens. So Chicago and Indianapolis are the two examples that come to mind of cities that have really taken the most full advantage of trying to allow citizens to innovate on platforms that they've made possible. When you ask millennials, would you prefer smaller government with fewer services or larger government with more services, they lean toward larger government with more services. And I think it should be our goal to say that's a false choice. We believe you can have smaller government, but better services. We don't believe that that's the contrast, the only contrast that's available. And by trying to use data to maximize the efficiency of our programs, we can spend less on them, we can have less bureaucracy, we can have less waste, but we're not providing our citizens less of what they really need.
I would just mention that we recently did a major study on open data and public attitudes towards it, and I would commend that to the committee's attention. It looks at the open data movement in local governments as well as at the national level as well, and I think it would have some guidance for the committee's work.
Well, we all know that President Obama campaigned on having one of the most open, transparent administrations in U.S. history, but a lot of millennials especially were really shocked by Edward Snowden's revelation, and now still 56% view what he did as favorably, and that's even ignoring that there would be a higher percent who disapprove of the NSA. So when we're talking about open and transparent government, it needs to, if we're going to be moving towards that, it needs to be on more all fronts. And a lot of millennials, they view foreign threats, it's just the world is less threatening to them, even though they did grow up, with 9/11, they've seen these things happen. But if we're, as we move government towards more open and transparency, which I think is a way we need to go, it needs to be more across the board if we're going to restore trust. When you have someone campaigning on doing so, then finding that there was a massive program that was anything but open and transparent, I think that shocked a lot of millennials, and it's something that still they continue to carry with them.
Thank you. I now recognize Chairman Messer for questions.
Thank you again. Thank the panel and thank my colleagues for being here today. I want to get at a question is, the topic of today's conversation is millennials and the GOP. And my question is really, is our challenge in reaching millennials more one of packaging or more one of product? And we all understand millennials believe in freedom. They believe in personal empowerment. They have a healthy skepticism of government. They've come of age in an era of customization where they're not used to one-size-fits-all answers in anything from their cell phone to the restaurant or anywhere else. And so they ought to like our answers for that. But I just would ask for the panel to expand upon it. Is it a challenge of packaging or a challenge of product or both?
I would suggest it's a bit of both. And the example that I've often used to kind of illustrate this point is from the 2012 election, both of the presidential candidates were offered the opportunity to do an interview on MTV. And only President Obama took that opportunity. And so he was interviewed in the White House by Sway Calloway, who's one of the hosts on MTV. And he was asked a question, which was, Mr. President, the young people in America, they idolize entrepreneurs like Mark Zuckerberg. They want to do that themselves. They want to start their own business. What have you done as president to make it easier for young people to start their own business? And I, as a Republican sitting back on my couch watching this, thought, oh, I wonder what he's going to say. And his response was wonderful. His response was, you know, we took a look at all of the financial regulations on the books, and we repealed some of the regulations that were prohibiting people from being able to raise small amounts of money from friends and family over the internet. And essentially, I signed a bill that allowed crowdfunding, Kickstarter, to be possible. And so that's one thing I've done as president to make it easier for young people to build their own economic destiny. What's fascinating is that's the Jobs Act. That was a bill that came out of the House with more Republican support, I believe, than Democratic support. And so in this case, the president was doing the marketing and he was selling our product. And so I would suggest it's a little bit of both. It's a need to make sure that we are making millennials a priority, that we are trying to reach them, that we are using new ways to communicate beyond just sending out press releases to print publications. But there's also something to be said for taking our principles and applying them to new problems, to making sure that the product we're selling isn't just something that's old but in a new box, but rather we're taking these principles of limited government and applying them to the new challenges that this generation is facing.
Just a couple points to add to that. One of which is that packaging is certainly a problem. As one piece of evidence, in our last Harvard IOP survey, the approval rating of congressional Republicans, it was in the low 20s. But unlike the Democrats, which was higher but still in the mid-30s, a majority of young Republicans disapproved of Republicans in Congress, right? So that speaks to me as a packaging issue, point one. Point two, though, as we talk about millennials, we have certainly seen kind of potentially like two generations within one. I think about kind of the older millennials, those young people who came of age around 9/11 and were part of the 2008 movement that elected President Obama. They continue to hold more kind of democratic-related ideals. As an example, 25 to 29-year-olds have a plus 18-point advantage among party ID, Democrats, Republicans. Among 18 to 24-year-olds, majority who came of age not during, Iraq, Afghanistan, 9/11, but they came of age during the Great Recession, they still prefer Democrats, but by a 12-point margin. So I think we begin to think about the newer millennials, those just come of age, versus the older ones, as well as we think about product versus packaging as well. Thank you.
What we find is that people tend to identify with the party that most closely matches their underlying political values, and in my testimony I described how the values differ between the generations. Both parties actually tend to do a little better in terms of affiliation than you would necessarily think, just by counting up the number of liberally leaning people. The Democrats get more support than just the liberals. And the Republicans actually get considerably more support than just the conservative-leaning millennials. But the underlying driver of party affiliation, in my view, is political values and the degree to which those align with the parties. And so we can't give political advice given the nature of our charter, but this is as much a question of how the policies of the Republican Party align with the values of this generation as it is anything else.
Yeah, I would say instead of rallying against big government, per se just big government as opposed to small government, what millennials want is on each specific issue. And we found this, my co-author Diana and I, when we were writing our book, we spoke to millennials, is it fair that Washington now prohibits you from taking an unpaid internship? Is it fair that you're going to be up to paying for these entitlement programs that you never voted for and were really put in place before you were even born? Is it fair that you're born into the national debt? Is it fair you're paying more under the Affordable Care Act so that older people who have a lot more wealth than you can pay less? And on issue after issue, they tended to agree with us. But when you ask them in general about big government versus small government, that I would say is a messaging problem that we need to focus more on the issues and the individualized, not one-size-fits-all solutions that can be offered.
I now recognize Ms. Brooks from Indiana.
Thank you. I'd like to start out with you, Mr. Meyer. You've discussed that most millennials consider themselves socially liberal but fiscally conservative. How do we bridge this gap? And I'd be curious in what the rest of the panel thinks as well, but like for you, start.
I think a way that the gap can be bridged is if we look at the governors of Massachusetts, Illinois, Maryland, where they ran in traditionally blue states, but they decided, I'm running to fix your economy. That's what I'm coming here to do. I'm not, as Larry Hogan said, I'm not running to be your pastor or anything like that. I'm running to fix the economy. Here's the common sense ways I'm going to do that, and that's what I'm coming here to do.
Again, we shy away from providing advice on issues, so I think I'll pass to Kristen on that. Thanks.
So it's certainly the case that millennials lean more socially liberal than perhaps older generations, but there are a lot of issues within that bucket of what we think of as the social issues. So on something like, for instance, same-sex marriage, there's a clear generational divide between where younger Americans and older Americans are at. However, on, for instance, the issue of life and abortion, there's actually not that much of a generational divide. There may be a generational difference in how we talk about the issue and the relation of that issue to, say, religious beliefs, but the divide on that issue between younger and older Americans is not nearly as great as perhaps the media would have folks believe. So kind of within this bucket of social issues, there is a lot of diversity of opinion. I think the big challenge for folks on the right is there's a sort of a tendency to want to shy away from these debates when it comes to talking to younger voters on the grounds that, well, there are some of these differences and how do we navigate that? The challenge is if Republicans don't talk about what they're for, it allows the other side to define their position. So I think it's very important for Republicans to not allow the other side to sort of mischaracterize their positions on some of these issues. A great example, frankly, is what Cory Gardner did in Colorado when he sort of called, it said that he was against birth control. I've done research on behalf of the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, studying what young Republicans think about birth control, and they're actually quite positive about it. So having a candidate come out and say, I'm positive about birth control too, was I think very good at sort of inoculating him against arguments that would mischaracterize, take these issues off the table in a way that's more effective than simply just sitting back and being silent.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think one overall thing that young people seek, and we know that from our own lives, is they want to be recognized, right? So the fact that we're having this hearing today, the fact that members of Congress seek their opinions on a regular basis will matter a lot to begin to develop some connective tissue for them to think about politics and service in a new way. So the very fact that you're doing this, I think, is a signal to young people across America. We've asked a series of about 15 or so ideological questions for about a decade or so, and of the 6 questions that more young people in America kind of agree with and disagree with, I can bucket half of those in the Democratic camp, half of those in a Republican camp. For example, concerned about the moral direction of the country, 52 to 16. 52% of millennials agree with that. Basic health insurance is a right for people, 45 to 23. Cutting taxes is an effective way to increase economic growth, 40 to 20. Okay. Education system will be better with more school choice, 40 to 24. And then we have government should spend more to reduce poverty, 40 to 24, as well as government should do more to curb climate change, even at the expense of jobs. So you can see within those top 6 issues, some of those seem to be more progressive, liberal values, arguably some of them more conservative values. But the fact is that I think young people are fiercely independent and want to be wanted.
Thank you. You're back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Smith from Missouri.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed the testimony. My question is there an issue that's just what you believe would be a make or break issue for the millennials? Like from a member of Congress, if we supported issue A, that the millennials would definitely not support us. Because we just heard from the gentleman of 6 different issues, 3 that are very liberal policies and 3 are very conservative policies. So I'm just curious if there is a uniform make or break issue, in your opinion, that would just say millennials would not support that candidate if they are in support of that issue.
I think it's hard hard to choose any one issue and apply it sort of across the millennial generation. Again, because as Scott mentioned, there's a huge diversity of opinion, sort of ideological belief even within the generation. I think what millennials are looking for is not necessarily to disqualify anybody because of one issue. As Congressman Messer mentioned, millennials are very interested in customization. They're not interested in labels. They're not as likely to identify as either Republicans or Democrats. They're not as likely to identify as, say, environmentalists. Anything that involves a label or it's my way or the highway, or you have to fit a strict definition of something, millennials kind of shy away from. Think about when you had to buy an album back, a couple decades ago. You bought all of the songs. Now nobody uses them for an album. You go on iTunes, you pick out the songs that you want, you make a playlist, and that's that. So I would encourage you to think about it a little more like that. It's about sort of conveying that you have shared values rather than having than worrying about any one particular issue that's going to be make or break with an entire generation.
So what I kind of get from your answer is the millennials are looking for more of a reasonable candidate that believes in developing policy that moves our country forward and proper governance, someone that's reasonable and will look at both sides.
Absolutely. Again, as Congressman Stefanik mentioned, this is a generation that's both very frustrated but very optimistic and very of the mind that these problems we're facing are big but can be solved, and they want folks in office who share that view.
Not so much the all or nothing approach.
I would say that.
Perfect. Mr. Meyer, what would be your opinion?
Well, as I said, I spoke with a lot of millennials when working on the book, and the one issue that came up over and over where there is no compromise on it is really the federal position on same-sex marriage. And if we look at the polling numbers, it's 73% and growing. They're in favor of allowing same-sex marriage, and even though marijuana legalization would be about 68%, it didn't have the same passion that I saw when people were talking about it. Whereas they would be willing to debate that or bring up, let's find a policy, a middle-of-the-road thing. But on same-sex marriage, from what I've found, at least talking to millennials, I don't see a lot of leeway on that issue.
I think I would agree with that, in that I think that while same-sex marriage does not appear anywhere on the list of most important problems facing the country or most important issues to young people, it is a sign of affinity with the times, and so it has a tremendous amount of symbolic value for young people, and particularly for people who are supportive of same-sex marriage. But I would also make the point that I think that expectations for government tend to be very low, not only among millennials but among other generations, and as a result, there probably aren't a lot of issues that are on the list that would be break issues in terms of particular positions. The one issue that might be a make issue is education. It comes up at the top of the list of priorities for young people, and we know that because of the tremendous amount of student debt that people are carrying, that finding a solution to that problem so that people have access to education without having to carry crushing debt into their early adult lives could earn a party a great deal of loyalty from a generation.
Very quickly to add to that, I would argue that before any elected official talk about a particular position or an issue, we need to start with forming a relationship, right? Young people are checked out of the system. They don't trust what elected officials and government has to say. So I think we need to find some shared values to begin that relationship. And I would suggest that starts with a collaborative spirit. If you look back at the ways in which certainly the Democrats ran the campaigns in 2008, the candidate that was seen as more collaborative and open was the person who was more successful in the Democrat primary. And I think the same spirit can hold true for the Republican Party as well.
I now recognize Mr. Costello from Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
I had a line of questioning, which I hope I'll get to, but in the meantime, my staffer, who's millennial, she's 23, texted me a question while you were all testifying, and I actually think it's a very good question, particularly when you consider how much we get in our news feed on Facebook and how that really is where so many get their news. Kristen, you mentioned the importance of embracing the technological advancements that millennials have come to depend on so heavily. What are some of the most common mistakes you see elected officials make in the way they use multimedia to communicate with millennials, and how can we engage more effectively? And I would also pick up, you mentioned developing relationships. I think that social media does provide the ability to, it sounds sort of weird because it's not face-to-face, but develop relationships, but there's clearly a way to effectively do that with the millennial generation, and there's clearly ways to sort of turn them off before you ever even have an opportunity to introduce yourself to them. So
I think it's a wonderful question. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see is folks using new forms of communication in very old ways. Twitter is not a place to just post press releases and you get a gold star for having used Twitter for the day. I think it's important for folks to use these new tools in the way that they were designed and in the way people organically are communicating on them. So, Instagram is a great way to do visual storytelling, and you can use it to post charts and interesting things, but really you can use it to create a window into your life, your experience representing your constituents, so that folks feel like they have that personal connection and have a window into what their elected representatives are doing, so that they can feel less disconnected and less alienated from what's going on here in Washington. So I would suggest, when using these new tools, think about how people use them in their personal lives, how they function organically. Not everything has to be perfect and manicured and pristine. That a lot of these new tools, it's about video that might be a little bit rough, a little bit it's stuff that's very candid, but it's offering people a window into something that they might not have been able to see otherwise. And so I would suggest when using these new tools, don't be afraid to show a little bit of your personal side and really use it, as you said, to build a relationship with your
keep it real.
Keep it real.
Congressman, I have one example of outside of my work at Harvard, of a piece of technology that we developed. It's a strategic version of crowdsourcing. In other words, what we're able to do is actually model the representative form of government. We would work with mayors, governors, secretaries of education around the country to try to solve a very particular issue. So for example, you can pick an issue, how to extend the school day. And we would invite any member of the community to participate online. They need to register with their name, kind of like a letter to the editor, and we would accept for about a week or so any idea that was kind of part of the forum. It would be moderated. And that would be kind of the first phase. So we would have hundreds of ideas, comments and suggestions and votes. The second phase, though, is we would recognize, on behalf of the government, we would recognize a dozen or so people who had the most impact in that forum. It didn't matter what age they were, what level of education they were, as long as they had a good idea, we'd recognize them to say, we need more from you. We were empowering them with fully vetting a particular idea and collaborating with their colleagues. What would happen is we would have a 20-page report, maybe co-written by 10 or 12 members of the community, some of which are millennial, some are others. At the end of it, we would secure a meeting with the representative, the governor, the secretary, who would kind of hear their ideas. In other words, if we empower that opportunity, hundreds of people participated through a representative form of big ideas like the House. We'd have a smaller committee vet through them, and then we would take that smaller committee directly to the member, whether it's the CEO of an organization or whether it's the highest ranking member of the public organization we're working with. That's a specific idea. We get hundreds and hundreds of great ideas. It changes people's lives when we do that.
Just to sort of rehash what Scott and Kristen have sort of said, major cultural change, rapid innovation, more diversity, process information differently, broader flexible definition of family, higher college debt, lower wealth, less likely to be married, less religious affiliation than previous generations at the same life cycle. And the question relates to the 51 to 35 Democrat to Republicans self-identified. And when you look at political socialization, obviously you said political values, I think also parents factors in there. Given the fact that the millennial generation and even Gen X is more, I hate using too much in the way of generalities, but more independent, right, than past generations. Do you see the partisan self-identification being something that is less, do you see there being more opportunity for that to shift over time, depending upon how we either embrace or fear a lot of sort of the evolving priorities of the millennial generation as they get older?
Thanks, Congressman. That's a very good point. I mean, part of why people take on a party affiliation has to do with what the spirit of the times was when they formed their political identity in adolescence. And so we have an interesting chart in one of our reports on party affiliation where you can look at who was president at the time a person turned 18. And there's a very striking correlation between the popularity of the president and his party and the party affiliation, or at least the leanings of the generation that comes of age. And I think one of the reasons why we have so many young people who are independent or don't take an affiliation, 50% in our polls today, is that the president has been fairly unpopular over the past several years, but so has the Republican Party. And so people are left not having a good guide to help them figure out what they think in politics. And I do think that what that means is that even though there is a connection with the underlying values, as I said before, there's also room, there's a malleability in our politics today that maybe we didn't have at the beginning of the millennial generation.
Malleability was the word I was looking for, that I just couldn't get out. Thank you, Mr. John.
Your first question wants me to remind all the participants that we have a hashtag GOP Future. If you have questions, once we're done, we'll open it up to those questions. But I want to recognize Mr. Hardy from Nevada.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Stefanik and Mr. Messer for this opportunity. You know, I'm a father of four. All four of my children are millennials. I'm a 32-year-old down to a 23-year-old. So growing up with that generation and learned from my children very much, but they're a little different than what some of you talked about. They are very fiscally conservative. Not one of them has any debt. 3 of them are married and have this attitude of, one of them definitely has the attitude of what Mr. Meyer spoke of there. And I was excited to hear what you said, that millennials are more fiscally conservative and less socially involved in government. Is that the way you stated it?
Yes. Yeah.
And with that being said, to me, when I look at the Constitution, it almost sounds like these millennials must be reading the Constitution, because that's what I believe our founding fathers intended. And I am a Constitution conservative. So with that being said, Mr. Keeter, you stated that they look forward to a bigger government. They like a bigger government, but does those two contradict each other just a little bit, if I could ask that, or am I misunderstanding?
I should point out one interesting wrinkle on that bigger government preference. The Reason Foundation ran the same question and then got similar results, but then also ran the question again, but prefacing it with bigger government paid for by higher taxes, just to remind them of where bigger government is going to come from. And then the results swung drastically almost the other way. So, everyone wants a free lunch when they can have it, but if we can remind them that eventually when they get jobs and when they paid off their college debt and they're paying taxes they're going to have to pay for these services, they're a little more hesitant to ask for a larger government.
With that, has there been any studies done on millennials when it comes to, it seems academia is where the millennial generation is headed. Totally academia, the vocational type education has not been of any interest. Is that, would that be the case, or is it just my thought process? Anybody have studied that at all?
Well, our sense is that the high rates of college enrollment, while characteristic of social changes that have been propelling in that direction for quite some time, are also a direct result of the recession, where job opportunities were so slim that a lot of people went to college who might have gone to a trade or a profession, or at least put off going to college. And so some of what we're observing is a kind of inadvertent consequence of diminished job opportunities during the period from 2008 till relatively recently.
My question leads me just in that vocational education side of the trades, which I've worked in my whole life for 40 years, and done very well economically in that trade. I've watched over the last 12 to 15 years that it's been very hard or very difficult to find individuals who wanted to get involved in the trades. Even now, when there's job opportunities, it's usually undocumented workers or others that fill that void, and it doesn't seem like we're wanting to fill that void. Is there something we can do to change that attitude, or is it, I guess I'm just trying to understand a little more.
Well, I did, in my book, I do have a chapter on higher education and talking about the benefits of community college or vocational schools as an alternative. And I think, I don't know exactly what can be done to change this, but there is a culture right now where you have to go to college. That's what you're told by the media, that's what you're told by your high school guidance counselor. And right now we're shuffling a lot of students into four-year universities, whereas at 4 years only 40% of them graduate, and only 60% graduate within 6 years. So we're pushing students to take on a lot of debt when there's alternative career paths that are just as promising and come with a lot more affordable price tag. So I think that is something to look at, and it's an interesting way to push as an alternative too.
Just a comment to that, interesting, I went to 1 year of college, and guess what they told me the whole time? That I needed a college education to survive, because trades are going away. And so it's an interesting thought process, but the link between this and campaigns, I'm the type of guy, and Ms. Brooks, you're probably not the oldest person here, by the way. With that being said, you know, it's hard to teach an old horse new tricks, so to speak. I've tried, my children have tried to teach me, two of them are very, very techie. With that being said, is that going to cost me an election in the future by not being able to reach out to those millennials? Or is there still that opportunity that I like to believe that social connection, that I can still connect with the millennial through personal one-on-one?
Congressman, if you don't make an effort to reach out to millennials, that could cost an election, because it's the largest generation in the history of America. In a presidential year, more people under 30 than over 65 will cast a ballot. So regardless of how it happens, having a relationship with a millennial is key. But what I would argue is, I think about these phones less about technology and more about psychology. Like in terms of the ways in which you respond and react and create relationships with people offline, those same things can happen online. So I don't think there's anything to necessarily kind of be scared or shy away about. Is think about ways to apply what you do offline into the most appropriate online channels. And I think millennials will appreciate making at least some effort.
Thank you for all being here.
Before I recognize the next member of the task force, I just want to make an announcement. Hashtag GOP Future is the second highest and most trafficked hashtag in Washington currently, so let's keep it up. And now I want to recognize Mr. Palmer from Alabama.
Not sure this is working. It's all this technology.
Sharing economy.
Yeah, he's I think a millennial, are we? You're on the cusp. He claims it. One of the interesting things that's going on in politics right now is polling. And the fact that so few people have landlines. I'd say most millennials don't have landlines. So I'd like to know how you do your polling among millennials. And I'll start with Mr. Keita. Thank you, Congressman. Been a big concern for us ever since really 2004, when it was one of the most common questions that I got was, how can we trust your polls, because my children don't have a landline. And this was back when 7% of adults were cell phone only. Today it's 45%, and functionally probably considerably higher, because a lot of people have landlines and don't use them. So we started calling cell phones in 2006, and we made them a regular part of our surveys in 2008. And today, 65% of our interviews are conducted on cell phone, only 35% on landline. And there are a number of surveys out there, including the University of Michigan's survey of consumer confidence that you hear about every month in terms of the Consumer Confidence Index, that are 100% cell phone, because people recognize that that's the way people can be reached these days.
Do you get a good participation rate?
No, we get a terrible rate.
Yeah.
Our response rates are around 8%, and we keep waiting for our polls not to work anymore, but they still produce samples that are very close to what we know the population to be based on the census and the American Community Survey. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that even the 8% are representative of the general public.
Ms. Anderson is anxious to weigh in on this. Go ahead.
As someone who is very young in the field of polling, this is something that keeps me up at night. What will this field evolve into? as the traditional phone research becomes tougher and tougher to do. And especially, I believe just last week, the FCC voted on a new rule that will actually make a lot of telephone research potentially much, much harder. So for me, I've been really interested in exploring online research tools and ways to reach young people. For the general population, there's still a lot of debate about to what extent online research is the right approach for understanding the whole country, but for understanding millennials, I think it's a very effective tool.
In your testimony, it's interesting that when you listed the top 4 things in regard to how millennials want to be identified, I really think 3 of the 4 related to character. And I'm just wondering how millennials would characterize themselves in that context, you know, caring, hardworking, responsible, but did they view that in the context of character?
When I think about character and moral values in the millennial generation, I go back to this concept in political psychology. It's called moral foundations theory, where they say, you know, when people decide what's right and wrong, you know, what their character is all about, how they determine is something moral or immoral. They can ask a variety of different questions. Is something in keeping with tradition? Is something pure? Is something fair? Is something causing harm to others? There are a number of these different questions. And the research has shown that sort of conservatives tend to ask a lot of those different questions: tradition, purity, weighing, as well as is this causing harm, is this fair? While folks on the left side of the political spectrum tend to focus most on those questions of harm and fairness. Is this harming someone, and is this fair? And in the research that I've seen, millennials seem to be defining character by these harm and fairness sort of questions, even viewing really economic issues as moral issues. Is the economic system being fair? Are we causing harm to the poor, or are we doing right by those who are least fortunate in our society? So when I think of millennials and how they think of character and moral values, I do think those questions of sort of harm and fairness are really at the core. Am I being responsible, or am I causing harm to others? Am I being responsible? Am I being caring, or am I not being fair to others? I think these are the real questions that are animating for this generation.
One of the interesting things, and I was trying to look this up, I wasn't checking tweets or Facebook on my phone. I was trying to look this up so to get the numbers right. So I asked for a little grace here if I get the numbers wrong. But I think the last state to have a vote on traditional marriage was North Carolina. And I followed that with a great deal of interest to see where millennials would be on it. And the early polling, I think it was polling from the Public Policy Polling Company, which is, I think, a left-leaning polling group, indicated that millennials would vote against the amendment 62 to 38. And I believe that the amendment passed and that it was 52-48. Only 52% voted against it. And I find that interesting in that they had their polling, they were very confident in their numbers, yet polling has changed. And I just wonder if there's despite the fact that millennials don't attend church with the same regularity that other generations have, if there's still that latent sense of tradition, for lack of a better word.
So I don't know that I would use the phrase tradition, but as there's a lot of change in how millennials are, say, structuring their families and thinking about religion, but they're also somewhat skeptical of some of those changes. They're living the changes, but they're not sure that it's 100% great for society. However, when it comes to things like gay rights, the polling is overwhelmingly clear and almost unanimous on where young voters tend to fall on these issues. And I think earlier when I mentioned that the social issues are not all viewed the same, where you have abortion being viewed very differently than, say, gay marriage, on that it's, I think, a question of harm and fairness again. For many young people, they view marriage as just a simple question of fairness, that no one's being harmed by extending marriage rights to same-sex couples. While on the other hand, for abortion, there is a victim, that there is harm that's being done. And I think that's part of why you see the divergence in those two issues in terms of public opinion with millennials.
Well, and going back to the North Carolina vote, the thing that I find interesting is that we're all subject, whether we admit it or not, to a certain amount of peer pressure. We don't want to be viewed as bigoted or biased. And I wonder sometimes in the polling, you don't get the exact answer that reflects where a person is on it, but when you go into a polling place on election day, you vote your conscience. Madam Chairman, there's not a clock to tell me when my 5 minutes is up, so the red light is on. May I ask one other question?
Sure.
I know you won't believe this, but I was at one time 18 years old. And one of the early elections was Jimmy Carter in 1976. And I supported President Carter. 4 years later, I supported President Reagan and never went back. And I just wonder, as you're looking at the millennial generation, I think this is an important point to consider is as this group ages, even though they're marrying at a later age, bearing children at a later age, do you see their views changing as they age, start families?
I think it's dangerous to bank on that. I think political views, as Congressman Costello noted, are more malleable at that younger age. But as you get older, they tend to solidify, a bit like when you poured wet cement, and over time it gets harder and harder. I think that's an instructive way to think about the political views of this generation. When the earliest millennials first came of age, they came of age in an era when President Obama was just being inaugurated and was very popular. And so the older millennials, they grew up in this era of hope and change. However, the younger millennials, and I'll let John Della Volpe weigh in on this a little bit further, they've come of age in a very different time, a time where there's been a lot more economic dissatisfaction, they were not caught up in hope and change, and so it's actually possible that the younger millennials are perhaps more winnable than those older millennials who are at the point where they're getting married and trying to buy homes and things like that. It's not always the case that as folks get older, they get more conservative. In the 2000 presidential election, actually, George Bush and Al Gore basically tied with both younger voters and senior citizens. There was almost no difference between your vote based on your age. While when you fast forward to the 2012 election, there's a huge generational polarization. So what we're seeing now, I believe, is outside the historic norm and does make me concerned that young voters, without being given a compelling reason why they should become more conservative, may continue to be more left-leaning or more democratic for the rest of their political future.
My last point, I want to touch on right there, you talked about a vision and really a positive attitude. From what I've seen in interacting with millennials is they're tired of the negative. They want a vision for the future. They want to see their role in it. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Hurd from Texas.
I'd like to thank the distinguished gentlewoman from New York for holding this panel, and I appreciate our esteemed guest here today, and some of the materials y'all submitted earlier has already changed some of my rhetoric where I'm talking about a more efficient government rather than strictly reducing the size and scope of the federal government. And in my whopping 22 weeks in Congress, I've been wanting to do something, and I'm gonna hope y'all indulge me. Everybody say cheese on 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank y'all. And I'll make sure to put that on hashtag GOP future. Question is Mr. Della Volpe. Excuse me, I have horrible allergies. You're saying that in some of your research, that young Republicans had a very high disapproval rating of Republicans in Congress. Do you have any underlying data, issues, or reasons for that?
I think it gets to gridlock. I think that it's as simple as that. I don't think that they believe that they're being kind of listened to and valued, and a lot of the frustration comes from from a good place in which they want to make a difference. I don't think they see themselves being recognized. We haven't probed much more deeply into that, but it's a significant find that we've seen through several of our surveys.
Excellent, thank you. And my next question is to you, Mr. Meyer. You mentioned that 2/3 of millennials think that government is inefficient. I hate to break it to everyone, it is. And do you have specifics of some of these, when further asked questions about that feeling, examples of why they feel that way?
Well, I think one of the reasons, as I said, millennials are extremely entrepreneurial in their ambition, but in actually starting their own companies, it's a far lower percent than people who want to do it. So I think they have seen what some of their friends have went through or their parents when they're trying to start a small business. I mean, there's a store that just sells cereal that I saw in New York when I was up there. I mean, the millennials are looking to, to work in not just where they clock in and do a 9 to 5. They want to find work where they're passionate about. But when they find that government regulations standing in the way and not protecting public safety, they view that as a complete waste of their time and their energies on when they're trying to find fulfillment through work.
Excellent, thank you, sir. Next question, Mr. Keeter. I think in your list of issues that, top 10 issues that different generations think are important, terrorism, foreign policy, national security, I think that was a top 5 for millennials. Can you characterize where that concern is when it comes to national security?
Millennials in our polling tend to be a little less supportive of the use of military force as the best way to ensure peace, but they're just as concerned about international threats and global threats. It's hard for us, some of us at least, to realize that there are many millennials who were very, very young when 9/11 occurred, and so terrorism may not have exactly the same resonance for all of the millennial generation that it does for those of us who are older. But they don't differ significantly. They're less interested in foreign affairs in general. They know less about foreign policy. I mean, it's generally true that young people are less engaged in politics than older people. It has always been that way, and they're less likely to know things. But they are especially likely to be disengaged from foreign affairs as a generalization than other generations.
Thank you, Mr. Keeter. And the same question to you. On foreign policy and national security, like I spent 9 years as an undercover officer in the CIA. I have 820 miles of the border with Mexico. This is an important topic that I spent a lot of time on, and I'm interested in the perspective.
So data that I had seen from about 2 or 3 years ago suggested, as Mr. Keeter notes, that millennials were sort of less enthusiastic about a sort of robust foreign policy and a large, strong military. But I think there's no issue on which public opinion is more fluid than foreign policy and national security, because every new threat that arises dramatically changes people's view of the world. And so I'd actually defer to John Della Volpe, who has, I think, sort of some of the freshest data on what millennials think about national security and foreign policy in sort of the post-rise of ISIS era, which I believe suggests that millennials are now leaning toward a more robust role for America internationally and militarily.
And I'll do that and come back to you, Ms. Anderson, in a second, because I want to end with a question to you. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. In the most recent IOP survey we released in April indicated that 57% of 18 to 29-year-olds, including majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, strongly or somewhat supported ground troops to fight ISIS. And I think one of the drivers of that is obviously the way in which kind of those heinous acts have been reported through YouTube and video clips and those sorts of things. It's a complete game changer. It makes these things much more tangible than they were perhaps a generation ago.
Thank you. And Ms. Anderson, I want to say thank you for some of your comments about the false choice between efficient government and more government. I think that's a great way to answer that, and the framework of harm versus fairness is important. And my last question to you is, where do we find millennials? Yes, social media, leveraging that. Is it, political organizations on campuses? Is it young professional events in various industries? How do we reach out beyond social media to target and spend time interacting with millennials?
So millennials are everywhere. They're not, thankfully, an alien species. I think if you're talking about on campuses, if you're talking about political organizations on campus, those are folks who are already engaged in the process. Those are folks who, are to the extent that it's a center-right group or Republican group, can be great allies. I think the folks we need to be reaching are the ones who look at a political group on campus and don't really think that there's anything there for them. And there you can meet folks who are looking for jobs. You can find folks who are engaged in their churches, in their communities, or engaged in volunteer and service organizations. I think to the extent that we have more and more Republicans who are going out and engaging in service in their communities, reaching out to groups of folks that Republicans may not stereotypically be thought of as going to talk to, And as much as we are talking, doing even more listening, I think is absolutely essential for Republicans. So I don't have a neat and tidy answer about where we can find them, because millennials are everywhere. But I do think that we should be looking to go outside of our comfort zone, and when we do, listen as much as we speak.
I appreciate that, and Madam Chairwoman, I yield back the time I may or may not have.
Thank you. I want to recognize and welcome Congressman Curvelo, from Florida, who just joined us. And I wanted to put Mr. Meyer on the spot to see if he'd be willing to read the questions submitted with our hashtag from the screen, and then the witnesses can answer it.
What suggestions do our panelists have to actively, in all caps, show that the millennial generation we can be a party that to show the millennial generation we can be a party that supports them? Hashtag GOP Fusion.
Do you want to take that one, or?
I would say one option that could be looked at, especially with possible changes coming to the Affordable Care Act, would be changes in the modified community rating, where right now in the law you can't charge an older person more than 3 times what you're charging a younger healthy person. So I think this is something where the law remains unpopular among millennials, even though its aims and what it's pushing to do remains popular. So the way the law was set up, it shifted the cost from older, wealthier Americans to young, healthy Americans who have less assets. So I think looking at a way that would open up more options for young people and allow them to get more affordable coverage, where in the first year of the law, 27-year-old males saw a 91% increase in their premiums. And I don't think their care got 91% better. So when they're being asked before subsidies to pay $2,600 on average in deductibles, this isn't the kind of health plan that they're looking for. And, $2,600 in premiums, this isn't what they're looking for. And I think showing that you can keep parts of the aims of the law that they're looking at while shifting the burden off of their shoulders is a way that, that the lead can be taken.
Mr. Keeter?
Well, as a representative of a nonpartisan organization, I think I'll adopt that. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson?
So I think portability is a real key here, when it comes to things like retirement, when it comes to things like healthcare. I would expect that most of the folks in this room are no fans of the Affordable Care Act. One of the interesting pieces of it that actually sort of originated in conservative policy circles is this idea of beginning to disconnect a little bit the link between employment, your employer, and your health insurance. Millennials do change jobs an awful lot, and the idea that you then might have to change your doctor every time you change your job is just very disconnected from where young people are. So as we're thinking through what conservative alternatives to the Affordable Care Act might look like, really keeping a focus on how we can make sure that folks are getting affordable health care that is not linked specifically to their job, but is something they can carry with them, and how that fits in the overall framework of a conservative alternative is key. And I think the same kind of principle applies to how we think about retirement. I think it was the Office of Personnel Management did a big study trying to understand millennials in the federal workforce and why were millennials not interested in signing up for jobs with the federal government. And part of it was that, the reason why you would take a government job a couple decades ago was you had the stability of the great benefits and you would stay there for a while and you knew you would move up the ladder and you'd get this pension at the end. And now in the private sector, things like these defined benefit pensions are sort of going the way of the dinosaurs. And at a much slower rate in the federal government. And I think to the extent that we can begin either reshaping, at a small level, reshaping the federal workforce and how we reward and compensate employees there to better speak to millennials. But frankly, pushing policy ideas that make it easier for millennials to save for their own retirement, given that I think most of the polling that all of us have seen shows millennials don't believe that they're going to see very much of programs like Social Security by the time they get older. Helping them to be able to save for themselves and be responsible and be that sort of small c fiscal conservative in their own lives is a big opportunity for us.
Mr. Del Volpe?
Thank you. One of the questions we've asked for several years in our survey is how likely would you be to attend a political event if asked by a friend? And folks who were checked out of the process, millions of young people would show up at least one time if they were suggested to do so by a friend. So one thing I would strongly suggest is that you empower young people at the local level to diversify the message, to show specific examples of how governments, because we're talking about government, can be tangible and effective. We need to kind of repair. I think before you can have a debate about one issue or the other issue, you need to kind of repair the relationship and let young people know that politics matters. what's striking is, in an off-year election, in the last 2014 election, we had more young people volunteer and vote, right? So they cared about making the community better. They just didn't believe that the act of voting, whether it's through absentee, internet, or in person, mattered too much. So I think we need to think about repairing the process rather than just thinking about this issue or that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I now want to invite one of our young staffers here today, Katrina Burlett from Congressman Peter Roskin's office. You want to come up and ask your question?
Hi. So I am wondering how you guys think the Republican Party can remain relevant when the U.S. population is increasingly desirous of truly equal opportunities for people of different genders and races, and it is consistently the Democratic Party which is seen as sympathetic toward those pleas.
So I'll tackle this question from the position, focusing more specifically on young women and how Republicans can talk to young women. So I recently did some research for an organization called Empowered Women, where we did a survey of young women across the country. And we said, do you believe in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes? Do you believe that men and women are equal? And huge number, over 80% said yes. And then I said, do you believe that today's feminist movement represents your values? And only 44% said yes. So there's a huge gap there between sort of the number of women who are looking for who believe that women are equal, they're looking for some folks to talk about empowerment, and the number of women who actually think that sort of the left's vision of feminism is getting the job done these days. So I've been talking about the ways that we, at our economic vision, are making it easier for someone not just to start and run a big corporation, but to make it easier for someone to be able to make stuff at their home and sell it on Etsy and not have to jump through 18 different government hoops and fill out all kinds of crazy paperwork and pay an accountant thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to make it work. I think there's opportunity for us there. I think talking about ways to get people higher education that are innovative and go beyond the traditional, you've got to go to college for 4 years and take out a bunch of debt to get this bachelor's degree, to only realize at the end, maybe you think you need a graduate degree because now that's the norm. I think, looking into things like being able to offer sort of skills-based education online, just to help folks pick up a skill or two here and there rather than needing to get the full 4-year credential, is another way that we can talk about offering economic opportunity to folks who are looking for it sort of beyond traditional Republican constituencies.
Thank you.
Great. I'm gonna, James Marsh from Congressman Glenn Grothman's office. Do you want to come up and ask your question?
Thank you. I just want to preface my question by thanking Chairwoman Stefanik for running and serving in Congress. I'm from the 23rd District of New York. Our state's very proud of you. My question for the panel is, how can we get millennials not just to be politically engaged by voting, but actually to run for office, particularly at the local and state level? So, in other words, to use Mr. Delavolpe's terminology, how do we get them to see political activism as another form of social activism that they'd be comfortable undertaking?
It's a great question. One of the most important drivers that we found very early in our research was that young people had a different view of politics if they had met an elected official during their middle school or high school years. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a senator or governor, member of Congress. He or she could be a school committee person, city council or mayor. So I think really focusing on reaching out and showing young people at their earliest age about the difference you can make. Young people want to make a difference. They want to be asked to do things. And I think if we spend more time kind of empowering people to think about those things, that could be more effective. I think just the other thing I'd note is that when we talk about Democrats versus Republicans, the Republican Party may never win the millennial vote, but you don't need to win the millennial vote to win the White House or win an election. You just need to lose it less badly than you lost it in 2008 and 2012, right? 33 points and 23 points. John Kerry, the only segment of the population that he won was the under 30 group, but he lost everybody else, which was a very close election. So obviously we need to empower everybody to participate, but just to put some perspective into things from which I see it. Thank you.
I would add one thing to that. I think whether you're a Democrat or Republican, the issue of recruiting young people to get involved in politics at the local level is an important one. But our research on political polarization suggests that the perception of conflict in Washington is turning people off to politics, and especially so among young people. And while, asking this committee or anyone in Congress to try to solve the problem of political polarization is pretty Herculean task, that's one thing that might make it more likely that people would decide to take the first step at the local level if our politics was not as sharply conflictual as it is today.
I'm going to recognize Chairman Messer to ask the next question from Twitter.
Using technology here to reach this. Forgive me, Mari Butterazzi, for mispronouncing your name. I'm almost certain that I did, but my apologies. The question is, how can the GOP regain the support of the more moderately centered millennial generation? What messages should be revisited? Kristen, Jared, and of course open to others.
So I always preface my answer to this kind of question by saying, I don't think anybody should change what they believe for the sake of political expediency or trying to reach a younger generation. And I also sort of push back against the premise of the question in that it's certainly the case that younger voters, even younger Republicans, tend to consider themselves more moderate than older generations, as Scott's data showed earlier. What I think the challenge, therefore, is for folks who do consider themselves conservatives or strong conservatives, is to figure out how their principles lead to solutions that make sense rather than just ideological wins. We've talked a lot about this concept of big government versus small government. So for somebody who's a strong ideological conservative, the idea of shrinking government is in and of itself an end. While for others, it should just be a means to an end, that end being less debt, better economic outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the challenge isn't necessarily for folks to change what they believe, but to focus not just on what those ideological wins look like, what the shrinking government as an end in and of itself, but rather what it is a means to an end to do, so that folks who are not necessarily, don't think of themselves as perhaps constitutional conservatives, can still see that there's some upside and benefit to the policies we're talking about.
Can I kind of expand on that too? I think it's a fascinating question, and maybe broaden to the larger crowd. The president has had the biggest bullhorn in America for the last 7 years, and he's really good at throwing up a lot of straw men. Okay? So I think part of the reason why I see this sort of reflection of some, because they've been hearing the straw man arguments about what it means to be a conservative and what it means to be more moderate or liberal, and that is some, I think Mr. Keeter and others said, who the president is sort of can define the debate, but it seems to be one of the challenges you talked about earlier, Kristen, is we have to press through those arguments and make clear what we're really about, and not just the sort of straw man characterization of what the left would say we're about. I guess that was a statement, not a question.
I would concur.
I would say one thing is for either party to tackle Social Security head on. If we look at millennials, over 3/4 now would favor private accounts, other reforms that are politically toxic for the general population. But they know something needs to be done. I mean, I spoke to one millennial who said they just view Social Security as another tax. They don't view it at all as a retirement savings program because they don't think it's going to be there for them. Even though the program will still be able to pay out benefits, and that's not even how millennials view it. They view that it will be gone. This isn't going to be there for me. This is just a way to take care of older Americans. And if we look at the numbers paying off the unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare, it would require, right now, if we wanted to do it without any other adjustments, a 57% increase in all federal taxes or a 37% decrease in all federal services besides interest payments on the debt. So this is a major problem that they see. It's off in the future. And for politicians to actually step up from either party and say that this is a problem, we need to take on the AARP, and we need to realize that even older Americans, they want opportunities for their children and grandchildren as well. So this is an issue that I think could appeal to, and it already does appeal to, a wide array of millennials.
I want to recognize Reagan Payne from Congresswoman Brooks' office.
Hi, thank you all for having me here. As a millennial currently working to pay off student debt, I'm certainly part of the 80% of my generation who consider student debt a very significant problem. So how big of an issue do you anticipate that student loans will be in the 2016 election, and do you believe the cost of higher education will become a defining generational issue for millennials? Thank you.
So I think the challenge in the coming 2016 election is I believe that student debt will be a major issue. And I believe most of the things that we will hear coming from sort of the Democratic side will wind up being very expensive. They'll sound nice, but ultimately it's sort of having millennials pay less now to pay much more later in taxes down the road. And so our challenge as Republicans is to figure out how do we help folks manage debt for sure, but not have our higher ed policy just be about debt management, but also be about ensuring that people in the future don't have to take out as much debt to begin with in order to get the skills they need to thrive in the economy. So earlier I think I touched on a little bit, how can we talk about higher education and getting people skills in an affordable way? I would encourage folks on this committee to look at things like, for instance, the example of Western Governors University, which is a bipartisan effort launched by governors out west, as the name would suggest, to get people sort of the skills they needed in education in a way that is extremely cost effective, can work for folks who can't devote time to full-time education. But it also wasn't just about sort of how long you sit in a chair in a classroom. It's about proving that you have skills. And so people graduate from there with skills that they can use in the workforce and with very little debt load. You've also now got interesting things like edX, for instance, which offers really incredible college classes to folks via the internet, and you can get a certificate for having taken those classes. I mean, I think talking about ways that we can support more of that kind of innovation in how we deliver skills to the next generation is another thing we need to have in our higher ed platform, in addition to talking about how do we do debt management better in a way that isn't going to place a huge burden on the taxpayers, but does understand the huge burden that is facing millennials.
Yeah, I should say one thing with the promising alternatives to education that were mentioned. One major barrier is that without gaining accreditation from the schools that are already accredited, or who's pretty much running it, they're really cut off from federal funds. And because the government now is spending about $170 billion a year on these funds, that's very important, so it kind of cartelizes, it creates a cartel among universities. But it's not just that the choice is between debt-free college or free college, which has been proposed recently, but that's just really putting a Band-Aid on the issue. The main problem is the increase in college tuition, which has shot up 1,200% since 1978, and food costs have only went up 240% over that time. So until we do something to address the increase in costs, which I see the federal government student loan programs having a large factor in that, in effectively writing colleges blank checks, it's just going to be putting a Band-Aid on the problem and pushing the costs off till later. So it's a hard debate to have because it is, a complicated issue on how increasing these loans for people who could already go to school is driving up the cost of college. But it's something that needs to be said because, as you pointed out, it's very appealing to say free college, but it's a much harder debate to try to lay out why costs are going up so much. But it's a debate that has to be had.
I now recognize Representative Corbella for a question.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Congratulations to you and to Mr. Messer for this initiative. This is a wonderful opportunity. I want to ask a quick question. I apologize, couldn't arrive from Miami earlier. But there is this great concern among millennials for equal opportunity and making sure that everyone has a fair shot. And in my view, the education reform movement that conservatives began in the mid-1990s has given low-income students and minority students more opportunity and more hope in this country than any welfare or public assistance program. What else can we do to, number one, highlight those big wins, and I know there's a lot of politics and a lot of demagoguery surrounding education reform these days, but what can we do to highlight those big wins for poor students, for poor families in this country? And then on the policy side, what else can we do to make sure that our education system is designed to benefit students and not the adults and all the other special interests that are involved in education. Who wants to take that?
So this is a tough question from the federal level, given that as Republicans generally, there's more of a hesitance for the federal government to be playing a robust role in this space. However, there is federal money that goes into education, and as a result, I think the federal government has a right to expect results and expect states to be good stewards of those dollars and make sure that it's being put to good use and it's going to the kids, not to the adults. And I think what makes this issue so fascinating is this is a perfect example of where Republicans have been what's new and Democrats have been the protectors of what's old, where you have the forces of the status quo. You know, when folks think about which party is new and which party is old, unfortunately I think Republicans get characterized as the party of what's old and the party of the past, and education is perhaps the best example of where it's Democrats that are protecting a system that has failed over the last few decades, particularly failed the poorest kids, and efforts to try to disrupt it and try new things have been stymied along the way. So I would encourage, even though when it comes to education policy, there's perhaps less of a strong federal role there, think about what are the other ways where the status quo is being protected in a way that is harmful to this younger generation, and therefore Republicans can be the party showing we're trying to disrupt, we're trying to try things that are new, we're trying to bring these systems out of the 1970s and bring them into the modern era. I think that education is one, but certainly not the only field where we have an opportunity to do that.
Thank you.
I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today and the time they spent preparing it and answering all the questions. I also want to thank my colleagues, my fellow members, and staffers for their great questions. And before we adjourn, I'd like to recognize Chairman Messer for any concluding remarks he may have. Oh, I didn't know we had time for that.
Well, we want to apologize to Katie for the fact that we weren't able to get to your question. We promised we'd be out of here by 3 o'clock. I want to thank the panel for your testimony today. I think there are incredible opportunities. I mean, clearly the millennials are the rising generation of leaders in this country. And they're a group that, as my friend Jason here said, we don't plan on losing. Okay? So we got to push forward with the policies it'll take to win that generation over. Thank you.
I also would like to offer a few final comments before we adjourn. Again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Chairman Messer for allowing us to really put together this task force and empowering fellow members to focus on key issues. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your thoughtful testimony. I'm committed to continuing this conversation, so this will be one of a series of hearings that we'll be having focused on solutions and policies that we can propose that are very important to millennials. I think some of the key ideas of transparency, accessibility, and accountability in government are going to be very important for a governing Congress. I think college affordability is a key issue we're going to have to tackle, and issues of economic empowerment, breaking down those barriers for young entrepreneurs as they're seeking to start businesses. So thank you for kicking off this task force so effectively, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Did my phone die? Did it die?
Music part.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have we caught up to the end yet?